The year is 2022. The world collectively learned how to waste $44 billion. The UK loved their Prime Minister so much they decided to have 3 of them, and this gene finished up work for the Christmas holidays on the 23rd of December. I had no Christmas presents wrapped, the place was a mess, and I was hoping to have the remake video finished before the new year. Christmas Eve arrived, and with all these jobs surrounding me, I decided to finish a jigsaw puzzle I'd started earlier in the year. 3,000 little cardboard pieces lay before me, almost all of them already in place, depicting a worm's eye view of the famous Flatiron Building. At this point, all that remained was the sky, subtle tones of blue and white taunting me with their similar shades. Clearly, it would be an all-afternoon job. And so for some background noise, I hopped onto Netflix and stuck on the documentary A Killer's Mistake. So engrossed was I in this true crime documentary that I continued watching even for a while after I'd finished the puzzle. And so began a days-long binge of numerous thriller and horror movies on Netflix. Some good, some bad, but altogether over the Christmas and New Year period, I ended up watching The Woman in the Window, The Empty Man, The Caller, Escape Room, Alien, and Alone. I also saw Scream for the first time ever, and rewatched The Menu and Barbarian after having seen them in the cinema earlier that year. If you're curious about how I'd rank these films, the list would look like this.
You see, on top there's Donalino, there's me, and there's regular fish.
Oh, that's me.
No. There's plankton, there's single-cell amoebas.
Then there's me.
I'm getting there, there's coral, there's rocks, there's whale poo, and then there's you.
That's messed up.
I had a lot of fun this Christmas with thriller films. Maybe it was just the selection of films I chose, but even the bad movies were fun. Except you. And had at least a few nail-biting sequences. Except you. But as I was binging these films, I did start to notice that structurally, most of them shared one big similarity, and that so many of these films struggled to maintain their atmosphere during the third act, if they even had one to begin with. Now please don't get me wrong, this is not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, some of the movies actually benefited from a climactic tonal shift, but in the very same breath, some of them didn't, not even in the slightest. The last film I watched in this thriller binge was Barbarian, a movie that I'd seen in the cinema earlier that year, and I cannot overstate this enough. It's a film which I absolutely loved, and one which I still do love, but one which perhaps has the biggest and most uncalled for atmospheric shift out of the whole list. To be honest, it's what's inspired me to even make this video in the first place, because the tonal shift was just that sudden and jarring, and it all happened just because of one scene. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Barbarian is a 2022 horror sleeper hit and the solo directorial debut of actor Zach Cregger. The film was a critical and commercial success, making nearly $50 million in the box office against a $4.5 million budget, and receiving largely positive reviews from critics. The film itself has a fine premise which begins in the very first scene when Tess, played by Georgina Campbell, arrives at her rented Airbnb in the dead of night, only to find that it's already being occupied by this lovely creepy gentleman Keith, played by lovely creepy Bill Skarsgård. We have our conflict and we know exactly where the movie is going, only we don't know where this movie is going, ever. At no point in my initial viewing did I have any idea which way the script was heading, and this isn't helped by the fact that after the first act we leave this setting entirely and follow a brand new Justin Long character for about 20 minutes as his career collapses after allegations of misconduct. The nice thing about the script, however, is the fact that everything that feels disjointed and messy at first finds a way to connect together, for the most part, which is far more than can be said for a lot of other horror movies. The movie honestly does a great job cultivating a very tense atmosphere with a growing sense of claustrophobia, and an even better job at temporarily swapping that tense atmosphere for moments of lighthearted humour. There's a scene in particular after Justin Long's character AJ comes home to find an underground tunnel beneath his house, the same house rented by Tess and Keith. We, the audience, have seen at this point that things did not end well for our original pair while exploring the tunnel.
Not going back!
So when the first thing AJ does is find the tape measure and tries to find out how much this extra square footage is worth, it becomes a squeamishly delightful moment of humour as AJ descends deeper and deeper into the cavern, all the red flags that were so tense the first time we saw them zooming right over his head. It was one of the funniest scenes I saw in a cinema last year, but what's really impressive is how the film is able to immediately swap that humour out for the tension we got so used to in the first act. It doesn't feel awkward or forced. I felt that it was a very natural transition from humour to dread in this sequence. This then continues into a 1980s flashback into a day of the life of the original house owner, Frank, an individual we know absolutely nothing about at this stage, yet over the course of just a few minutes realise is a serial stalker and abductor, bringing unsuspecting victims back into his home in what might be one of the most chilling sequences of last year, and far and away the best made scene in Barbarian. The film's careful atmosphere definitely peaks at this moment, but doesn't actually implode until the end of the film in, as I mentioned before, just one scene. So, what was it that killed Barbarian's atmosphere in the end? Well, it wasn't just one thing, but a series of creative decisions all happening in order, like removing the bottom row of Jenga bricks and watching the whole tower fall. I won't call them mistakes, as on their own they don't automatically spell the death of a film's atmosphere, as we will see. Some of these decisions actually benefit a film when done effectively. And for a fair comparison, I'm going to be looking at other films in the same relative genre as Barbarian in the horror and thriller categories in order to see how other films handle these decisions, which ones work, which ones fail, and what it was about Barbarian's handling of them which contributed to the untimely death of its carefully crafted atmosphere. I'm going to start with the creative decision, which is maybe the easiest to pull off well, and that's the change of scenery in the third act, when the film, for the most part, takes place in one enclosed location, Octoben. Our characters are thrust out of their comfort zone into a brand new arena for the climax of the film. There's a lot of benefits for a thriller to remain in one general location for the runtime. It greatly helps to create a sense of claustrophobia and tension when the protagonist isn't able to just leave whenever they want, which is why a lot of great horror films, old and new, stick to this formula. The Shining, Midsommar, Halloween, The Babadook, The Lighthouse, save for maybe a couple of scenes, all of these films remain in and have their climax in the same location throughout. When I talk about a change in scenery, what I'm referencing are films like It or 10 Cloverfield Lane, for example, where the majority of the film takes place in or on top of the town of Derry or in an underground bunker respectively, only to have these settings flip on their heads when approaching the film's ending. The narrative decision to do this isn't always a bad one, but it can be difficult to maintain that tense atmosphere in a brand new location where the mood hasn't had time to establish itself yet. To talk about this now, we can't ignore the T-Rex in the room. One of the most infamous examples of this third act location change occurs in The Lost World, where in the third act we leave Isla Sorna entirely, and the film devolves from an action-adventure with some thrilling moments into a generic monster film set in San Diego for the final act. It's a really bizarre and jarring finale to the film, which has since gone down in infamy for obvious reasons. Although, funnily enough, it's only the second worst Jurassic Park film to take dinosaurs into the human world, so at least it has that going for it. At first, the example I was going to use for a film that does this well was Alien. However, one of the films I watched over Christmas does this in a much more subtle way. Alone is an excellent thriller which I really enjoyed. It follows our protagonist Jessica in the moments leading up to, during, and after her kidnapping and her subsequent attempt to escape. The film's first act genuinely feels like it takes a lot of inspiration from Duel, one of my favourite thrillers of all time, and a film I've already covered on this channel before. But from these first few scenes, the film presents its audience with an intense, claustrophobic atmosphere. A large portion of the second act focuses on Jessica's escape into the forest and attempts to outrun her captor. For a film set largely outdoors, the sense that her captor is around any corner feels choking, especially later in the movie when he's equipped with a jeep and a rifle. The claustrophobic atmosphere contrasts impressively with the outdoor setting. Now, this does change near the end of the movie in a subtle way. Throughout the third act, there's already been a slight change in tone as Jessica attempts to confront her pursuer rather than outright escape, and this comes to a final conclusion when the pair find themselves in a clearing. With nowhere left to hide, Jessica has no choice but to finally face her captor head on, and the pair begin a tense fight to the death. Right here is the subtle change in scenery. After being oppressed, surrounded in tree cover, bodies of water and small caves for the majority of the film, finally, there's nowhere left to hide. The clearing acts as an arena where the final battle can take place, no longer a game of cat and mouse, it's a brawl of which there can only be one victor. The setting changes as does the atmosphere, but it still remains tense, just in a different way. It's a cathartic release of all the tension the film has been building up to, and it's a great finale with strong imagery which sticks in your mind long after viewing. Or, it's stuck in mine at least. Now, after hearing this with Barbarian, you might think that this second act scene change, where we start following AJ in sunny LA just after watching Keith get his head turned into tomato soup in the house's basement, would be the moment that kills the film's atmosphere. I don't think this is the case, however, because Barbarian does get its atmosphere back and excels at it later in the film. The scene that helps kill the atmosphere is the second last scene of the film, the climax, where Tess and AJ escape the house with Andre, a character who was only properly introduced at the start of the third act. The trio escape from the mother, this film's chosen villain, and seek shelter in a nearby abandoned building. Now, I will say that the actual change of location here on its own isn't really a massive detriment to Barbarian. The film already hops locations quite a bit, so it's not as jarring as something like The Lost World, for example. It's more so how the new location is handled which affects the film, and how the other two creative decisions play around the fact that the characters are here. This location on its own really could work and doesn't become an issue until the scene finishes and the other two creative decisions are left to play out, when it becomes apparent how much potential wasn't utilised by having a climax where all parties involved are unfamiliar with the location. But as is, there's an awkward lack of tension or stakes in this scene, the penultimate scene of the film, where we're given a sizable exposition dump as to the nature of the mother from a character we don't really know in a location that's never really been introduced to us, and it's here that the film makes the second of three mistakes. Like I said, Barbarian's third act change of scenery isn't the worst use of this creative decision in horror film. For a film that doesn't take place strictly in one location, the idea of having the climax take place somewhere other than the primary house doesn't kill the atmosphere on its own. I'd assume we're all aware with the well-known rule with horror movies and screenplays that the more you learn about the monster or threat, whether it be supernatural, scientific, or criminal, the less scary it becomes. Instinctively, fear comes from the unknown, so it's very important for horror screenwriters to be conservative when revealing details about the monster during the film's runtime. Any revelation can act as an unexpected hit to the film's atmosphere if handled poorly, and writers are always therefore at risk of losing an audience investment in their story. So, a lot of amazing horror films keep their audience ignorant of the monster's true nature well after the credits roll, although this isn't always the case, and there are definitely ways to reveal a monster without sacrificing the atmosphere in the process. Although it may sound counterintuitive, a good way to do this is to reveal key information about the monster earlier in the screenplay, rather than waiting for the end for a twist or shock reveal that may backfire and risk spoiling the monster for the audience. Take, for example, the 2020 remake of The Invisible Man. The film quickly sets up the premise that our protagonist Cecilia is being haunted by her deceased ex-partner. Quite early into the film's runtime, however, it's revealed that nothing supernatural is really going on. Cecilia is being haunted by a spirit, but by her very much alive ex-partner wearing a technological invisibility bodysuit. It takes a bit of disbelief suspending from the audience, which is why the reveal works earlier in the film's runtime rather than being a shock twist ending. By revealing information about the monster to the audience this early and allowing them time to adjust to this new information, the tension for the rest of the film comes from the dramatic irony of the audience knowing the absolute truth with Cecilia, and what will happen to her if she can't convince the rest of the film's cast of it. At this point, after revealing everything about a monster, some horror movies begin to rely more on situational horror rather than giving the monster more and more previously unmentioned, unforeshadowed abilities, which can retroactively cheapen everything which came beforehand. I love Halloween, but Mr. Myers does get less and less scary the more he does rise from the dead. A good example of revealing too much about a film's monster and then trying to recapture the original horror is what they did in the recent It duology. I feel like a lot of people remember the first of these films more fondly, myself included, and you hear a lot of reasons given for this. The sequel has problems, sure, but structurally, it's not too dissimilar to the better received first film. Each of the protagonists has their own little scare with it, and then the group breaks apart only to come together at the end to face the monster together. It's just not nearly as scary or effective as the first one, and it's nothing to do with Skarsgård's standout performance, it's the fact that we've seen it before. We know that the way to defeat Pennywise is just to not be afraid of him, and sure, the characters may not remember this, but the audience does. And so a lot of potential scares just end up becoming frustrating, no matter how much supernatural amnesia explanations the movie gives us to convince us otherwise. No matter how good a screenwriter is at revealing information about a monster, nothing can be scarier than what we imagine in our own minds. The subjectivity of horror films is why they're so difficult to write and even more difficult to end, because the moment you begin rationalizing a horrific situation, you risk imploding the entire atmosphere, which is more often than not built upon a foundation of the unknown. Barbarian, for most of its runtime, handles its monster revelations quite well. We're not actually aware of the presence of the mother at all until the very end of the first act. Up until that point, the film lets the audience's mind run wild with possibilities. The possibility that Keith is the antagonist until we see the surrounding neighbourhood. When Tess finds the hidden door in the basement, which leads deeper into a tunnel network, we still know nothing around the circumstances surrounding them. A cult, a serial killer, something supernatural. Even after we see the mother multiple times through the sequences with Tess and AJ, we know virtually nothing about her other than what she looks like. Finally, near the end of the second act, we get our first hints of the origin of the mother in the 1980s flashback, when Frank enters his basement revealing blood-curdling screams to the audience. This is legitimately scary. The entirely unknown nature of the mother, save for the few breadcrumbs that lead to Frank, who we already know is a serial abductor, allows the audience's fear to run completely wild with however they want to rationalise the monster, because let's be honest, what do we really know about Frank either at this stage? The relationship between the two antagonists is called into further examination when AJ discovers Frank still living within the tunnel system, his unkempt room being the only place under the house where the mother is seemingly too frightened to venture. And when AJ finds evidence of how Frank treated the women he abducted, the audience can begin to make an educated guess as to the nature of the mother. Still shrouded in mystery, albeit, there are enough puzzle pieces to begin to see clarity. At this point, all that needs to be known is known. We understand what they're doing narratively by making the mother a more sympathetic victim of Frank's abuse, while Frank is the truly evil antagonist of the film. I truly believe that this is all the explanation the film needed to give to the mother, to work with these pieces and to really drive home the tragedy of her character, while still maintaining her ambiguity and maintaining the film's atmosphere. But this isn't what happened, and when Tess and AJ escape with Andre, we essentially get a full backstory for the mother in the film's penultimate scene, with the explanation of her being a product of generational inbreeding, with Frank being neatly packaged in a brisk exposition dump by Andre as they shelter from her in a nearby abandoned building. Having the circumstances of the mother's origin spelled out for the audience after an entire movie's worth of dropping hints and painting a subtle background picture feels like an unnecessary reveal. The veil was pulled and there's no longer really a mystery to her character. It doesn't ruin the movie altogether, but it does diminish the atmosphere moments before the climax of the film. Now, the reveal of the mother's origin, which occurs in a brand new setting with a brand new character all occurring in the same scene, it hurts the film's atmosphere, but on their own wouldn't necessarily have ruined the ending had the film not made one final fatal decision which would allow for the disintegration of its waning atmosphere. I've mentioned before in other videos that I'm a firm believer in the best horror films following a determined set of rules. The rules don't necessarily have to be based in our own reality, just in the reality of the film. There's an allowance of disbelief suspension that could be afforded to any genre of any story, but this has got to be established by the end of the first act and followed through until the end of the tale. Now, obviously this doesn't mean that a narrative can't have twists, but these twists must make sense within the confines of the rules that the story establishes in the first act. Otherwise the very bedrock of the story crumbles and everything else with it. Not to dwell on it because I've mentioned it before, but It Follows is a perfect example of a film botching such an amazing concept due to its reluctance to follow through on its own rules. An unfeeling, unthinking being stalking and following its prey, not stopping or resting until it's killed its victim. An utterly terrifying concept that's worked in the past in numerous different genres to great effect. Where It Follows stumbles, though, is that the follower presented to us in the first act is a very different monster to the one the protagonists face by the end of the film. Once introduced to us, we're given a specific set of rules. Once the monster targets you, it'll walk towards you, will be visible only to you, and will never stop until it reaches you. Legitimately terrifying stuff. By the end of the film, every one of these rules has been broken. The monster climbs the roof and stays motionless for some time. It becomes visible when the victim cannot see it. It taunts its victims before killing, and it begins using tactics like throwing objects to kill instead. It's an enormous shame because early moments in It Follows are unrelentingly scary, but every time I watch the movie through, I'm just bored by the end of it because it feels like the creators lost faith in the scariness of their own concept, so started changing rules midway to surprise the audience, and I have to say, it's a strategy that doesn't pay off by the end. The sudden rule change is one of the easiest ways to kill the atmosphere of a horror movie, and the easiest way to avoid it is just to not attempt it at all. Now, that's not necessarily saying that there are movies that haven't pulled something similar off successfully. I think a film that pulls off something that resembles this rule changing a bit better is The Cabin in the Woods. Although it's more of a satire, not really taking itself seriously as a genuine horror film, it lets the audience in on its satire early on, creating some effective dramatic irony. The events of the film really are just one big game, a sacrificial ritual orchestrated by a committee of game masters who can change the rules at a whim. It introduces itself as a zombie flick, but at any point it would have made sense to introduce vampires, or a serial killer, or a dragon. So even though the rules of the movie are subject to change at any time, the rule changes still take place within the world the movie establishes earlier on in the runtime, so maybe it's not even that good of an example, to be fair. For the life of me, I just can't think of a horror film that I've seen that benefits from changing its established rules mid-runtime, and it's telling, I think, that one of the films that comes closest to achieving this is one that satirizes tropes from other horror movies. So it goes without saying, unfortunately, that Barbarian shares more similarities to It Follows than The Cabin in the Woods in this regard, where the monster or antagonist isn't consistent in its own rules. By the time the film is wrapping up, there's still not a whole lot we know about the mother, save for her abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. We learn at different points during the runtime that she's fast, nimble, and pretty much has an encyclopedic knowledge of the tunnel system beneath the house. She does not leave the house during the day, and finally she's strong enough to overpower our protagonist with ease, but not strong enough so that being hit by a car into a building incapacitates her, at least temporarily. All of this is primed for a thrilling climax where Tess returns to the house to rescue AJ. She has the odds stacked entirely against her, law enforcement doesn't believe her, and she doesn't stand a chance at defeating the mother physically. However, the pair succeed in escaping the tunnel system, meeting with Andre and hiding out in the nearby abandoned building, as we already know, and it's here where the first two creative choices were made that the final one comes along and obliterates the film's remaining atmosphere.
And she ain't never came in this motherfucker.
Call it the strength of a mother's love, but this right here killed Barbarian for me. As a character, we have seen the mother's strength displayed numerous times during the film's runtime. At risk of sounding insensitive, it took her 10 hits against the wall for her to semi-damage Keith's head at the end of the first act. We saw it again near the end of the movie that a car hitting her body only temporarily incapacitated her, a horror cliche, but fine, we can reasonably estimate the limits of her strength. A good tuban agus gan rawa, she completely demolishes a brick and concrete wall with one step, and then immediately afterwards struggles for a while to disarm Andre. It's so inconsistent and contradictory, not just to what came earlier in the movie, but even just within 10 seconds of itself. It's a lazy way to try and create stakes when really all it does is blow up the last bit of tension the film had. There's no tension when the mother jumps from the water tower to save Tess, and there's no tension when Tess finally defeats her with a single gunshot. It's just bizarre to me why they wanted to end the movie this way rather than playing to its strengths. Have the mother slink around the abandoned building, the characters doing everything they can to keep quiet and come up with a plan, knowing that the mother is disadvantaged being in an unfamiliar location. In that case, the change of location could have been a good creative decision for the movie, creating so much tension knowing that this may be the only chance the characters ever have to overpower their pursuer. I think that final interaction between the mother and Tess could have also worked in a more subdued climax, adding to the quiet tragedy of the mother's character. Instead, we have a crash, we have a rip, a push, a jump, and a bang. It's such a shame because I really, really, really liked Barbarian. It was my second favourite horror film that I saw of 2022. The initial Airbnb concept I think was creative enough, the humour was well placed, and the themes of trauma and abuse were well executed for the most part. Unfortunately, like so many other horror films, it struggles to keep up with that momentum through the third act. From what I see online, this was quite a polarising one. Those who loved it, but those who hate it really hate it. And you can say what you want about the forced humour or nonsensical plot or messy structure. In my view, almost everything that went wrong with Barbarian occurred in just one penultimate scene. The change of location, the expositional revelations, and the film's dramatic disregard for its own rules. 3 creative decisions which, on their own, as we've seen, don't necessarily drag a horror film down. But taken together, one after the other in the span of less than 3 minutes is, in this Gene's opinion, what ultimately led to the death of atmosphere in Barbarian.